and so on and so on, and so on and so on, and so on and so on.
Hey guys, how are you?
We good? Good.
And who do we got here? I'm Peter, who's talking. Who we got?
I'm Will. And Michael.
And we're Zizek and so on. And today we're joined by Matt Christman of Chapo Trap House and Hinge Points and Hell of Presidents. And we're very excited that Matt took the time to meet us today. And we just want to maybe have a few notes. We got a Patreon, got a YouTube, got a new website, courtesy of Michael. What's the website again, Michael?
zizekandsoon.com.
We got zizekandsoon.com. That wasn't like a porn site.
Yeah, go.
I remember when I went on animals.com when I was a kid and I misspelled animals and it was a bestiality website. the original Zizek and Soon website is just him eating hot dogs. It's actually him doing the hamster dance.
And so thanks for everyone joining us. Thanks to Matt and enjoy the interview. Thanks, guys.
And so on and so on.
Okay, so we're here, Zizek and so on, and today we're joined with Matt Christman of Chapo Trap House. Thanks for joining us, Matt.
Thank you for having me.
And Will, I think you had a question for Matt and to kind of orient what we're planning on discussing.
Yeah, so we wanted to maybe not necessarily like get your take on Zizek, although we can talk about that if you want. But we wanted to, if you would, talk to us about your recent project on Hinge Points.
Sure, of course.
Cool. So yeah, like I wonder if you can describe that project and what thinking about history in that way can sort of do for us in our political sensibility and sort of diagnosing today's political present.
Well, Hinge Points is a show I've done with professor of history, Daniel Hesner, or international relations, I guess. I don't know, whatever the hell they're making up in academia these days.
Mm-hmm.
And we examine in the first series we did of episodes, we sort of examined crucial turning points in sort of Western capitalism that got us to the point we're at now, where it really does feel like the project of a self-conscious working class emerging to challenge capitalism is seemingly moribund. And we examine historical moments to find out exactly what could have been different, what was contingent, what was determined by materials, and basically challenging that or playing with that classic historical dialectic between material forces and individual initiative and also just happenstance. And I think what's useful about that when trying to examine contemporary politics is that while, as I said, I do feel like one vision of human liberation is sort of moribund, that doesn't mean that we as individuals don't still have the responsibility to ourselves to live as though we have the ability to choose, and that every moment that we live in is just fraught with the same sort of contingent hinge points that historical eras were. But the problem is we cannot know while they're occurring what they are. And so by looking at what mattered in the past, what ended up determining things, it can be helpful in understanding what is determining things now and where contingency exists in the moment that we live in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I feel like people have a tendency to kind of like think that their subjective experience and subjective ability isn't really like available to create change in the world because of all these material forces. Like, I feel like you're trying to find a space between, abiding by a kind of materialist Marxist version of the explanation of history in the world, while also trying to insert some sort of subjectivity to the dynamic.
Right, exactly. To emphasize that there's always fluidity in every historical moment, which means that our moment, as seemingly overdetermined and fixed as it is, as we observe it, still has a lot of stuff happening where, in retrospect, we're going to see how stunningly close things could have been to something else.
Right. And like, for instance, with the pandemic, it felt as though this was a situation like one of the ones you might have discussed in Hinge Points, where it pushed everything to the point where it seemed like something needed to fundamentally shift to deal with it at all. And yet we see that it just gets recaptured by capitalism, by the state, I mean,
was there the potential there? I don't know. Like, it's hard to say.
My point is that it seemed, prior to potentially that it would force it to that point. Like, Matt, you were talking about World War I being that kind of hinge point that Marx might have understood to be, the moment where the working class rose up, and yet they didn't, right?
Right. Yeah. That was the moment where, because Marxism is really, at the end of the day, about a working class movement taking advantage of crisis within capitalism, and that was the apocalyptic crisis of capitalism, the First World War, and there was a working class movement that was relatively coordinated and spanned nations, and understood itself to be international and focused, but that when the actual the war came, failed to maintain their solidarity and instead fell back towards national loyalties.
Mm-hmm.
And and I honestly feel like what we kind of came to the conclusion of is that, well, that moment was probably unavoidable, that the time had not, there had not been sufficient accrual of meaningful coordinated action between national working class movements to overcome the incredibly potent force of 19th century nationalism unleashed on Europe. It's really in the intervening 20 years from the end of World War I to the end of World War II, really, when things I think could have been significantly different. And we talk about why that wasn't the case. And I feel like we have a similar situation with COVID here, whereas, as much as there seemed to be a possibility for a rupture of our governing institutions and understandings, given how much of a really radical challenge COVID was to business as usual, there just wasn't, at this point, you're dealing with a working class that's been fully dispersed since the fall of the Soviet Union, and where political subjectivity of any kind has been largely drained from Americans, people in Europe generally, and has failed to cohere along with like state power elsewhere. But I think similarly, as this crisis continues, as the crisis precipitated by the beginning of World War I continued, that the breaking up of a lot of regimes of control and compliance that we're already seeing is going to open things up significantly. And it's on us to be as aware as we can of what those moments might be.
So in that sense, does thinking about history go towards challenging that hegemonic ideology, like that kind of sense of the normal functioning of the American system, that it feels imperturbable?
Yes. But I mean, the thing that makes it feel so inviolable is that it was a regime that had a certain promise to its citizens, and that the background faith in that basic social contract undergirded a lot of the depoliticization and sort of compliance of the citizens, and that we are seeing in front of us start to decay. And that means that everyone's relationship to the state, to the market, is changing, and people are seeking some sort of sense that they have any kind of control over their lives, and because they're starting to realize that we really are in this our own, and that the state as we understood it to exist has been shown to be pretty much incapable of doing what we had assumed it could. And I mean, that does not necessitate the emergence of any kind of effective political countermeasure, because this is a process of Americans who have really lost political imagination in the last decades, and having to find it. And that's why a lot of the attempts to find a renewed political voice are so incoherent and reactionary and paranoid and completely fraught with media narratives of the very system that people are feeling alienated from. But that's just really the leading edge. This is a process that I think is metastasizing across social orders, and it's very much in the air how that's going to play out, I think.
So in some sense, like, the crisis will come, but the solution, the response might not, because there's at this point no way to coordinate it.
Right. I honestly do feel like nodes of coordination are going to, by necessity, emerge.
Okay.
As people are basically forced to rediscover their political agency, for lack of an ability to fall back on the sort of the nostrums of market capitalism anymore.
Mm-hmm. And who do you think that is? Like, there's a big question these days of like who the proletariat is, right? Like, it's not the classic sense of like the worker in the factory, and it's not like various people have said like, oh, it's refugees, or it's the general kind of like service industry, or like who does that look like, do you think?
I mean, I think at this point it looks like everybody who is outside of the tent of basic sufficiency.
Mm-hmm.
I would honestly, I think one of the big dividing lines in this sort of declassed social order, where you can talk about class as an objective thing and say these people have this relationship to production, these people have that, which means that they have this class, which might be true in some abstract sense, but is not experienced as a social reality.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I feel like things that are experienced by social reality are debt, and I would say a big one is home ownership, and the inability to access the thing that has been the most significant driver of accommodation between labor and capital in America, which is the promise of actual home ownership, the idea of security and sufficiency for a family, which is now becoming unreachable for a majority, certainly of younger people, and in that reality, it's much harder to find yourself trusting that the politics as it's been received to you can deliver for you in any meaningful way.
You think?
Right.
Go ahead, Mike.
So when we talk about the openness of history, when you're having this like retroactive look at history and seeing where events are foreclosed or overdetermined,
Right.
what's the difference between that historical look and trying to see in the present conditions the openness for an emancipatory project?
I think the thing that that pops out to me is where leadership of any of the counter hegemonic forces is located. I feel like one of the things that did hamstring significantly the working class movement at that crucial period during and after World War I is its leadership capture by, if not bourgeois, people who may have begun their lives as workers, but who found themselves immersed in bourgeois social spaces and found themselves, without even knowing it, becoming adherents to the bourgeois social order because it, in their experience, provided them with lives that were largely what they wanted them to be, what they imagined them to be, and that made it much more difficult to take the sort of necessary but terrifying risks at the key moments that would have been required to really challenge capitalism when it was vulnerable. Now we're in a situation where capitalism has basically completely swept the field, and there is a little remnant of effective working class counter hegemony, and we're seeing, as I said, the decline of any promise that people who are currently outside of the people who are outside of the protective basket of the homeowning class and the striver class who have been able to strive effectively has, I think, created a situation where any new movement is going to kind of be immune in many respects to those blandishments, because the system, I think, at this point is no longer capable of extending the promise of that kind of security and comfort to a large enough percentage of the population that it once was, because it's no longer in a situation of continued ascendancy where markets exist to be exploited and profit exists to be accumulated. We're now, I do believe in a now with that we have a truly globalized capitalism, a secular decline in rate of profit, which will make it much harder to buy anybody off or buy enough people off.
When it comes to like thinking about this, for everyday people, is it just about those sorts of material conditions that are pushed to that extremity, or is it important also to sort of to study, to learn, as Lenin might say, or as like Marx expressed when the Paris Commune was happening? He was like, I haven't finished my book yet. Like clearly there's like in Marxism as a body of knowledge, there is like the principle of theory, the importance of kind of understanding it in that lens, right? Through that lens.
Yes, I mean, I think anybody who can and is interested in theory should pursue it, certainly, because it's always better to be able to make legible what you're seeing around you in the news and such through a lens that cuts through a lot of the blandishments and the cliches and the just outright propagandistic framings that end up making it very hard for people to think about politics in a way that doesn't just reinforce the narratives of the state.
And in terms of like narratives, part of what you're doing on Hinge Points is kind of exploring counterfactuals and like is maybe creating it like an alternate and potential storyline, like a different way of exploring the potentials of a different path forward.
No, exactly. Like in my mind, if you can plausibly sketch a world that is like ours in its in the broad layout of material conditions and historical event that could have gone in a different direction and could have taken the forces that now really do seem to be on their last legs or completely decayed, or and if you're feeling very despondent, maybe can imagine never had the capacity to genuinely challenge capitalism. If you can to yourself, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. Obviously, we're talking about counterfactuals, but just as a personal as just a personal project to be able to imagine a alternative world made like ours but different, and especially if you can, to your own satisfaction, from reading, from theory, pick out the things that would have had to have been different, then you can live with a sense of possibility in your own life. I mean, and honestly, that is what is more necessary than anything else, because without the will to act, everything else is pretty much meaningless.
Right, because for so many people, the feeling that so much stands in the way of the act or of a political act is stultifying, when there's a way of looking at the act, like that Zizek talks about, for instance, that like the act has a certain violence because it is not within the coordinates of the system into which it intercedes. So like it always has that kind of gamble or risk attached to it, you know? And
I think one of the things that stops people is that they don't feel like if they don't feel that there's any real possibility that their actions or sacrifices will have meaning, will have effect, that's a huge demobilizer, because it takes a very special sort of sacrificial figure to be willing to carry out acts that are painful and threatening to their own well-being, purely for like an existential self-definition. I mean, there are a few people like that, but it's uncommon, and meaningful political change requires the actions of regular people too, and regular people have to feel that what they're doing might be meaningful, might be worthwhile, and that can only happen if you really believe that we do live in times that are malleable and can be shaped by human will.
And there's so ultimately we're always immersed in our own subjective experience, which of course has a relation to more objective material forces, but is always felt by us in a direct way. Is that like you talk a lot about religion? Do you think there's a role of religion in that sense, or is it like your tool for exploring the potential for change?
I do think that religion is a necessary component of large-scale effective political action, simply because thinking you're going to get things done will, in an imaginative sense, it is a process of building belief. It is a process in building a faith in that which is not seen, and to do that, you do have to marshal just spiritual, emotional understanding of your world that can recognize transcendent concepts. Because without that, I think if all that you believe in really is yourself, I don't know if the calculus is ever going to make sense to do anything but crouch and hide and hope for that the hurricane misses you, because you have to act not just out of a desire that things can get better, but a desire that things can get better for everybody. That while your actions might not lead to you seeing a better world, it could lead to a better world in the future, and that means you have to have a real emotional connection to people who you've never met and don't even exist. And I don't know how you build that without some sort of spiritual framework for understanding the world.
Right. And so like different modes of political organization can learn from the types of community that are produced by religious belief.
Right, exactly.
Enjoy the music for a minute.
The thing that I wonder about hinge points is like there seems to be a kind of like after the fact quality to it, and this is something that you and like you talk about, is like retroactivity with regard to, like, their word for it is event, but I think it's like pretty analogous to your notion of a hinge point. Is it like when you're within a certain situation, it can feel as though it's it's a real moment. Like for instance, like the Bernie moment that we all went through a couple
Right.
years ago.
Yeah.
And yet there's like if when you're looking backwards historically, like you have that hindsight, not just the benefit of it, but like in a way the hindsight is like how you can even make sense of the event. So like there is that kind of weird kind of temporality to it.
Oh yeah, that's the thing is that you can never know until after. You can never really get the shape of the thing until the moment has passed, which is another reason that you need faith, I think, and that you need a imaginary that allow you to step off of the ledge. Because if you are if you're seeking in the moment the solace of like historical existence and the material unfolding of history to guide you, you will come up short. There'll be a gap, and that gap is the nature of your fixed existence and your inability to access the full range of context that only comes retrospectively.
Yeah. And one of the freeing or like potentially emancipatory sort of elements to this is, as foreclosed as history is, as like determined as it is, there are acts and events that can be enacted now that don't change like the objective quality of that history, but do change the story, do change the narrative. Yes. And that means that history itself is open, and we are engaged in that process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like we are making the whole thing as we go.
As we go. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, precisely.
And also being able to recognize the way in which like certain projects fail too, right? Like, because that can be a huge thing with sort of bringing people to the left is like, oh, well, communism failed for X, these reasons, blah, 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 murderous regimes, et cetera, et cetera. But like, and oftentimes that's kind of left to either people who are like, fully take it up, like the tanky, for instance, or people who just don't consider it at all, right? But I think that kind of what you're talking about is like understanding the way in which something failed, and then that line, like that Beckett line, like fail better.
Yeah.
Right. So like there's a quality of that too, I think, in trying to understand history too, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I feel like it's the thing that makes it hard to talk about things like the Soviet Union, for example, is the amount to which people invest these things with personal identification for their politics. And that means that they find themselves, without even knowing it, not like trying to seriously engage with a historical moment or phenomenon and pick out like what's useful and what isn't. They end up either as a prosecutor or a defense attorney for people who aren't alive and don't really need you to do that.
Yeah.
So there, in some sense, there's kind of like, as opposed to a kind of staunch materialist, an idealism to what you're proposing here. I'm sure you come up against that dichotomy quite a bit, and you get maybe accused of it.
Like I mean, sometimes to me, I honestly feel like there's no non-idealist way to subjectively experience existence.
Yeah.
Our subjective experience of existence is navigating ideas. It is only it's materially fixed, but we aren't able to recognize our own material relationship. We are only able to negotiate it through these symbols and ideas that we decode our material reality with. Now that's different than how you can analyze history outside of your experience. But I think, the hinge points notion is to bring the subjectivity of a person living now to a historical moment, and understanding that, well, this is still a materially shaped phenomenon that that's not how it's experienced. And since people do make history, that the ideas that they are carrying with them have to be considered and integrated into our material understanding of history.
Yeah, also confusing how Marxism itself sidesteps the whole part of it being an idea as well.
Yeah, exactly.
What you're saying reminds me of, like not only a substance but also a subject. You know. Okay, but what then for like electoral politics then? I mean, what do you see as that like the deadlock of electoral politics giving us in the coming future?
I I had kind of an epiphany watching the first debate in 2020 between Biden and Trump, when they just were yelling at each other, and it was completely devolved, and I had this just liberatory moment of realization that these guys are they're running for president to enact policies. Hypothetically, people are invested in them to do one thing or another, but they clearly, the actual like people that we're investing with this hypothetical experience authority are just baseline mentally incompetent to do it.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, if the highest powers in the land are in the hands of people who are just functionally incapable of carrying out the job, then we have to step back from any idea that there's a lot of human agency at these levels of power. And for me, it was a process of stepping back from an overinvestment in a narrative. And as a result, I have kind of sworn off trying to predict things electorally, because I really do feel like there is very little meaningful motion there. There's not much that the individuals can invest there, because at the end of the day, all you can really do is care. Most of the time is just spend time caring about what is done by people in power, because what you can really do to impact them is very limited to voting every 2 or 4 years in a system that is designed to neutralize uncoordinated preferences, which is all we have in the electoral sphere, are the uncoordinated, individualized preferences of voters. So I am pretty much over electoral politics as a zone of meaningful progress. I think if there's anything that's going to move the needle, it's going to come from the practical challenge of people organizing for their lives as workers, as tenants, and that by doing that organization, I think that there very well might be an electoral element to that organizing, but it's going to not. I'm fairly confident. This is the one thing I feel pretty strongly about electoral politics wise. It is not going to be part of the party system as it exists, simply because both parties are designed to neutralize any outside energy. And of course, the thing that prevents third parties from rising is the structural nature of the American constitutional order. But the thing that the only time that doesn't hold is when one or the two parties is critically undermined and loses its market share. And I honestly do think that could happen with the Democrats.
Yeah.
I think that the Democrats are right now in a situation where their long-term electoral appeal is so narrow and so alienating outside of a narrowing group of voters that I can actually see them ceding enough space to some sort of insurgent challenge. Not necessarily, but I think possibly, because the Democrats they can offer at this point nothing to anyone except for a virtue signal to a slice of well-educated, relatively well-off voters. And that's who they talk to in their messaging. That's who make up their cohorts. That's where their votes are. And that is in a context of deteriorating material conditions. That's a context that's a recipe for disaster. They can't even offer the splenetic, visceral satisfaction of transgression and making enemies suffer the way that Republicans can. Their psychological appeal is entirely found in the superego and in self-denial, which is never going to be more popular than a politics of indulgence, which is what the Republicans are offering.
Yeah, some people have pointed out that like Democrats just don't know how to fucking enjoy themselves or enjoy.
They enjoy themselves by not enjoying themselves,
Right?
and
yeah.
you have to have a very certain acculturation for that to make sense to you. And it is acculturation that is a smaller and smaller percentage of the population. And I know a lot of people I think the last election and the shift among non-white voters towards Trump shows that a lot of people are going to give up on politics completely, as it completely fails to address any of their real life concerns. But other people who may recognize the pointlessness of politics are going to start caring about politics or care more about politics as a spectacle, as an entertainment, as it's becoming increasingly impossible to extricate politics from the generalized entertainment spectacle. And in that context, the Republican the Republican entertainment pitch is going to be vastly more appealing. And so I could see a situation where a lot of people are fretting about Republicans stealing elections or doing a coup or making it bring draconian voting rights restrictions. We could be looking at a near future where they're able to dominate state and federal governmental politics while winning majorities. And in that context, I think the Democrats lose any claim to being an effective bulwark against Republicans. I mean, they've already, obviously, for decades now, lost any claim towards a positive politics, but even their last gasp pitch that they are the thin blue line is going to crumble. And in that context, I mean, Republican governance will be horrible, will be wildly alienating, will be savagely anti-worker, will lead to more and more immiseration. And the people who suffer that are going to seek political remedies any way they can. That's going to be labor militancy, but at some point, given the nature of America's institutions, it will probably involve some kind of electoral organizing. And it very well could be that that's where the challenge to the moribund Democrats come from. But again, I try not to predict too much.
And this might be too much in the realm of prediction, but people talk a lot these days about populism being potentially a response to that impasse, both populists on the left and the right. Do you think that's in any way a solution here?
Well, the thing about the populism is that it is at the end completely captured by capital. I mean, like right populism and right populism, which is right now really the only kind of populism that has any kind of traction, and even that is mostly in the minds of people who spend too much time online, is fully captured by the commanding heights of the Republican Party. And left populism, as we've seen, cannot challenge effectively the commanding heights of the Democratic Party. So while I think like populist vocabulary is and concepts are inextricable to any American politics, just because we live, historically, and we can't. It's unlikely that we're going to see the emergence of something with a completely new political framework and language that would realistically grab anybody, I think that it will still be window dressing towards a movement that is fundamentally class based and that understands itself that way. Because I honestly think that's going to be the only thing left. Because part of the process of the wheels coming off as we're seeing this is the failure of every understood political category to deliver anything. And that will only leave the one that is unspeakable right now, and that is not addressed by the increasingly, I think, discredited political currents.
Yeah, because class-based politics cuts across, by nature of being class-based, cuts across the other sorts of divisions that people try to find in the political sphere, right? I mean, it really does seem like the only fucking hope.
And you're seeing like culture war is now the only politics.
Yeah.
And it's mostly being indulged in by anxious suburbanites who are relatively comfortable, while everyone else sort of tunes out. And I think that if circumstances reinvigorate political life in this country, the very fact that this is all anybody has actually been talking about while everything is getting worse will go a long way towards discrediting culture war and making the appeal of something that genuinely does cross over divides much stronger. People talk about how they want unity, that people talk about how they want to stop division, and the middle and upper class demand for that is basically their side winning, but the only real solution to culture war barriers, the only thing that can bridge them is an actual appeal to class.
Yeah. So speaking of, before we let you go, we don't want to keep you too long, but speaking of failed recent political projects, Michael and I were talking earlier today about Occupy Wall Street. But Mike came across a pretty interesting quote from Zizek, and I wondered if I could read it to you guys and maybe just get your thoughts on it before you leave, Matt.
Yeah.
Okay, so he says, what one should resist at this stage is precisely such a quick translation of the energy of the protest into a set of concrete pragmatic demands. Yes, the protest did create a vacuum in the field of hegemonic ideology, and time is needed to fill this vacuum in a proper way, as it is a pregnant vacuum, an opening for the truly new. The art of politics is also to insist on a particular demand, while thoroughly realist, disturbs the very core of hegemonic ideology, i.e., one that, while definitely feasible and legitimate, is de facto impossible. In brackets, he's got universal health care in the United States was such a case. In the aftermath of the Wall Street protests, we should definitely mobilize people to make such demands. However, it is no less important to simultaneously remain subtracted from the pragmatic field of negotiations and realist proposals. What do you make of that?
I do think that, yes, you have to maintain a horizon of revolutionary conflict. You have with the current state of existence, or else all of your demands will be sort of trickle away. But I do think that in the American context, that universal healthcare did really prove to be that thing, that undigestible demand. And I think that's why it became the banner, because while there's the pragmatic argument, hey, who wouldn't want to pay less for healthcare? There is the real, and this is something that was largely unspoken during the 2016 and 2020 campaigns by, honestly, people on both sides, people who didn't want to really deal with the implications of trying to impose from the commanding heights of American politics that kind of change on its political economy that abolishing private insurance is exactly the type of thing that the American political system is designed to prevent. And that a government that is capable of doing that is existentially threatening to political structures as they exist. And I mean, looking back on the way that Occupy kind of flowed into the Bernie campaign, I personally don't really. I mean, I understand the that Occupy. A lot of people can see it as a failure, and I do think that the resistance to any sort of demands ended up undermining its long-term ability to be influential. But at the same time, I don't really know if there was any other way that could have gone, simply because of the fact that it was an attempt to recreate a class politics out of basically nothing, out of rubble. And in that reality, there's no structure to organize demands. There is only this inchoate desire for change that then gets channeled by people's individual interactions with the thing. And the hope is that process then creates a constituency and will to move to the next level. And I think you can look at the Sanders campaign as that next step. Now, though, with the failure of that, we are not back to square one, really, but we are absolutely back to, I think, finding a new active. I think what we've seen is a couple of things that haven't worked, not in the sense that they have not led to a durable counter-hegemonic political machinery, but that are, I think, necessary preconditions for the emergence of one. And you saw the spontaneous organizing of Occupy Wall Street. You saw the more formalized attempt to storm the upper reaches of state power with the Sanders campaign, and then the once again sort of the fallback towards the spontaneous resistance of the Floyd protests. And if that cycle, of spontaneity and then organizing holds, we should see something else. I don't think it would be. I hope actually that it's not another rush towards the White House, because I think the obstacles to that have been pretty well shown. I think that the work is going to be much more agonizing, and it's going to be the sort of tedious base building that was going to have to happen outside of the spotlight of conventional politics. To me, the real sobering moment there was watching the Bernie campaign and seeing the failure of the message to penetrate beyond the cone of the politically engaged, the people who already invested politics with some sort of personal element, that their identities were, informed by their political actions. And that group of people in this country are in 2020 anyway, and probably for a while now longer, are going to be largely inoculated to class politics, because to invest yourself in political identity through the electoral system is to accept a lot of the premises of political narratives. And one of the main ones is that kind of stuff is impossible or bad. But it all shapes up to the same thing, which is a resistance to that. I think the Sanders campaign, I think, could have done things differently to try to get those people. Like, I honestly think in retrospect, but once again, retrospect doesn't do you any good at the time. They could have spent basically no money on advertisements and spent much more money on hiring people in distressed communities to talk to people. They did that to a degree, but considering how many resources they had, they could have done more. But once again, that's a thing you have to learn through experience.
Mhm.
And I think that will be hopefully the next phase will be significant, tedious outreach outside of the cone of political media.
Try again, fail better.
Exactly.
All right. Well, Matt, Christman, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Really enjoyed talking
Thank
to
you for having me.
Yeah. And enjoy your vacation. It's funny, by the way, that I know that you're in California. I realize that, but hey, I listen to the podcast. Yeah, Matt, thanks a lot, man.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And so on and so on. 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 And so on and so on.